They didn't call it an arrest. They called it translation into custody. The words wore a halo the way a cudgel wears ribbon. 2 Adeptus Arbites filled the doorway like a verdict made of ceramite. Their carapace plates were black and scratched and reverent with service sigils. Their vox grills exhaled incense and ozone that stung the soft places in my nose. One held the writ up so the lumen glare made it holy. The other watched my hands as if 10 small heresies slept inside them. The corridor behind them clicked with mag boots and discipline. Neighbors pretended to be walls. My name sounded different when the Arbites spoke it. It shed its dirt and oil and came back sharp enough to shave. Citizen Carlin Voss, designation 77 Alpha 9992. You will accompany us for verification. Verification tasted like copper before the cuffs even bit. I found myself nodding as if my neck belonged to the Imperium, and I merely rented it. The cuffs kissed my wrists and recited a litany in vox whispers only the devout or the damned could hear. Step obey. Endure. I said that I maintained grinding wheels in Sector Gamma 7. The reader tilted his helmet as if I had confessed to witchcraft. Not done. Measured. He said the word as if measurement were the only crime that mattered. Behind them, my hab breathed stale air and tried not to look small. The cot was still folded tight. The little photo of my parents still smiled like dawn on a world that never knew smog. I tried to pocket the frame with my fingers already bound. The other Arbite shook his head a fraction of a degree. Mercy measured in millimeters. I asked if I could at least lock the door. He said the Imperium never loses what belongs to it. Ownership settled on my shoulders like a cloak cut from night. We moved. The corridor tasted of disinfectant and cooked wires. A cherub servitor drifted overhead with ink-stained wings and a pen nib for a tongue. It wrote my passage into the air, and the letters hung like gnats. The lift cage waited with its brass beak open. We stepped inside, and the grate closed with a catechism clang. The lift rose through strata of lives I never lived. Lower hive thrum thinned into mid-hive order calcified into upper hive silence. Through the lattice I saw processions of clerks moving like a single organism with 10,000 pale hands. I saw a preacher in scarlet rags flogging a machine until it purred like a penitent. I saw a line of men with empty collars where their names used to be. The Arbites did not look. Looking wasted lore. The writ reader's gauntlet rested on the butt of a shock maul engraved with tiny, saintly faces. Each face wore the same expression found on statues of martyrs and men who have read the quotas. I asked what verification meant. The reader said it meant truth counted until it stopped moving. The lift climbed until my ears ached. The floor vibrated with a distant turbine that sounded like a giant clearing its throat before a prayer. We emerged into a transit gallery where everything was sober and tall and expensive. The ceiling arched like a psalm. The windows pretended to be crystal, but smelled like solvent and piety. A picked mosaic of the Aquila dominated the far wall and watched me with both heads and all its talons. Beneath it, a magistratum servitor sat on a throne of cables and stamped documents with a piston. Each stamp shook dust from the bones of the fortress. The Arbites marched me through a gate that recognized their boots and forgot my feet. We passed a statuesque sister in ash-white plate. Her helm was shaped for listening to sin. She did not move, and still I felt weighed. A boy in a grey shift mopped the floor with a rag that used to be a flag. He stared at my cuffs, and then at his hands, as if measuring the distance between futures. The corridor narrowed until the shoulder plates of my escorts scraped the walls. Rune lights buzzed in alternating frequencies that argued with my teeth. At each bulkhead, a scanner licked my retinas with cold light, and filed the taste for later. The Arbeit who watched my hands finally spoke. He asked whether I had ever been outside the hive. I told him the closest I came was a mural of clouds peeled by damp. He nodded as if that confirmed a theorem. We reached a chamber with a desk made of penitence and hardwood. Adept Thalison sat behind it with an augmetic eye that made a soft, gear-ticking sound like distant rain on sheet metal. He did not look up at first. His human eye was the color of reheated tea. He said my designation without tasting it. He said, "Selected without blinking." He said, "Sacred service," as if the syllables had been sanded smooth by use. The copper taste returned with its small, familiar knife. I told him there must be a mistake. His augmetic clicked once like a judge's stylus. The selection process is thorough. Your markers align. Your resonance registers. Your profile meets tolerances. He said tolerances the way a craftsman says edge. He told me to report to Sanctum level Omega 33 at the 19th hour. He told me preparation would begin the moment I surrendered my remaining stories. The room smelled of ink and old candles, and the skin of people who sit forever. I stared at the parchment charms pinned to his sleeves. Each charm promised a machine that it would be loved correctly. I asked what exactly sacred service entailed. Something moved under the tiredness around his eye. It might have been pity. It might have been envy. You will sustain the light that guides humanity through the darkness. He said it like a door that only opens inward. A servo skull bobbed at his shoulder with a quill clamped in gilt teeth. The quill dripped red wax onto a seal that bore my designation in a circle like a snare. The Arbites turned me by the shoulders with ritual courtesy. The cuffs chimed obedience in Binharik. We left the adept measuring the horizon inside his data slate. The corridor back to the lift had grown a spine. I felt its vertebrae under my bare soles, where the hab sandals had been replaced with paper slippers that educated the floor. We passed a chapel hollowed from old lore. Inside, candles burned behind wire mesh as if fire could be tempted by escape. A pict of the master of mankind stared at me with the patience of a starved god. A clerk knelt in the aisle and whispered numbers in a rhythm that could have been prayer or inventory. The Arbites paused at a sally port while a red-robed tech adept inspected the cuffs with a wand that smelled like rain struck by lightning. He nodded and stamped my air with a sigil that left no mark and every consequence. In the lift again, I stared at my reflection in the steel. It gave me back a man who would have failed to notice himself in a crowd. Oil under the nails. An old scar on the left cheek shaped like a careless crescent. Hair thinning like a retreat measured in strands. The Arbeit watching my hands watched my eyes instead. He said nothing. It was a kinder sentence than speaking. The lift spat us onto a platform where transport slept with their eyes open. One was a common hive tube with plastic benches and a smell like boiled patience. The other was smaller and paneled in dark wood, whose grain told stories about forests that once believed they were real. We entered the second. The benches sighed like old men in good coats. Brass fittings held themselves the way saints hold wounds. Incense filled the lung spaces and replaced the hive with mountains I had never seen and would never need. There were 7 others already seated. Each carried a version of the same question folded behind the eyes. A young woman with data clerk hands clutched an Aquila pendant until blood made the metal honest. An elderly man smelled faintly of promethium and regret and the heat of deep works. A boy's knee bounced as if he had enough energy to bribe fate. A woman with agra-groove lines in her palms stared at nothing with the precision of a plowshare. I nodded to them, and they nodded to me like mirrors trained to be polite. The Arbiters took the forward seats and became statues of law that could still reload. The transport hissed and the hatch sealed, and the world simplified. The motion was smooth, the way sermons are smooth. Outside, the hive unscrolled like a wound closing in reverse. Sheet metal gave way to stone. Stone learned Latin and became architecture. Gothic ribs lifted the corridors into the posture of belief. Relief carvings watched us pass with eyes that knew secret alphabets of pain. Servo skulls drifted like patient bees that tasted sin for nectar. We passed manufactoria that throbbed with second suns behind leaded glass. We passed archives where robed scribes fed data into cogitators through slits cut in vellum made from someone's failed future. We passed doors with no handles and prayers that grew teeth when you read them too slow. The Arbeit reader kept his gauntlet on the writ as if words might run. The other Arbeit kept his hand near the shock maul as if silence might. I tried to count breaths to build a bridge across the moment. I lost the number when the transport dipped and the lumen color shifted to the yellow of preserved bones. The clerk across from me whispered a name for courage, and it did not arrive. The old man met my eyes and gave me a smile made from promethium burns and 38 years. I asked him where the deep works ended. He said, in heat and in debt and in sons who learn the same lessons. The transport slowed, and the air grew heavier with meaning. Somewhere ahead, machinery prayed in bass. Somewhere above, a choir aligned its throats into a single blade. I had the sense of emerging into a throat that led down instead of up. I realized my mouth was dry enough to crack. I realized I'd been clenching my teeth to keep the copper from leaving. The clerk asked one arbiter if her posting would be notified. He said the administratum is a creature that always knows where its meat is. He did not mean it unkindly. He did not mean it any other way. We crossed a bridge of grating over a shaft full of cables as thick as childhood. Static raised the hair on my arms and rearranged my thoughts into neater rows. Below, something pulsed like a heart engineered to beat eternity into compliance. A servo cherub drifted by, carrying a wax tablet with sunken names. My designation glowed for a second, and then cooled. The transport made a final slow curve and settled to a hush. The hatch cycled with a sigh that sounded relieved to be trusted again. The Arbeits stood and became motion. I stood and became cargo that pretends at legs. The corridor beyond wore shadows that moved as if remembering previous occupants. Statues lined the walls. Their faces were ecstatic or ruined, or both. Their hands reached for things I could not see and did not want. The lumen strips flickered in alcoves that turned shadow into grammar. A voice spoke from everywhere, and from a red-robed figure whose brass mask suggested a human skull painted by a machine. Citizens, you will disembark. You will follow. You will not speak unless spoken to. The Arbeits handed me from jurisdiction to ritual like a coin changing pockets. The Tech Adept's movements were exact enough to make my own seem like a sin against calibration. We fell into a line that called itself a procession to feel better. My feet found the rhythm, and my breath learned obedience. The corridor stretched forward with the confidence of an answer that would never apologize. We passed picts of saints whose legends were a serrated edge against the eye. We passed gates with teeth and prayers with locks. We passed a checkpoint where Scutari stood as still as mistakes you cannot fix. Their augment limbs clicked in quiet hunger as scanners tasted our heat and measured our hum. Each gate opened because the universe had already decided it would. I tried to mark turns to build a map that could help some future version of me. The turns bled into each other until direction became an opinion. The smell shifted from incense to ion to oil to a sweetness that reminded me of old meat and new wax. Somewhere water sang in pipes the size of streets. Somewhere 1,000 quills wrote yes or no over and over until meaning thinned. We moved deeper, and the hive above us became a rumor. The air pressed on my chest like a hand teaching me to breathe correctly. The copper lifted and returned, and lifted again in small tides. The arbites peeled off at a side door marked with sigils that argued with my skin. The tech adepts took us the rest of the way with gestures that were half blessing and half mathematics. I tried to think of wheat and grinding wheels and bearings as smooth as prayer. The thoughts arrived with grease under their nails and looked ashamed. We reached a final arch where Auspec's pylons purred like content predators. The pylons tasted the shape of my fear and found it acceptable. Beyond the arch, the floor changed from metal to stone that had learned humility from centuries of boots. The stone was cool and sincere and old enough to have opinions about my weight. The corridor breathed once like a giant settling into patience. I could hear chanting far away and close by and perhaps inside my teeth. The tech adept raised his staff, and little sparks climbed it like insects with perfect discipline. We resumed walking because no one had told us to stop. My wrists pulsed against the cuffs in a rhythm that matched the deep machine heartbeat under everything. I did not ask questions because the air here kept the answers for itself. Every step felt counted and filed and judged balanced. Every lumen hummed a note that harmonized with the metal in my blood. I thought of Adept Thalasson's human eye, and the way it had nearly remembered how to feel. I imagined what envy looks like when it wears duty as armor. I told myself that sacred service was a phrase that could be true without being kind. I told myself to keep moving. I told myself to keep the copper inside my mouth where it belonged. I told myself that measurement is a kind of mercy when the alternative is guessing. The corridor carried us forward as if we were already part of the machine and only needed fitting. Somewhere ahead a door opened and did not close. The air changed again and learned my name. I did not say it back. Processing began before the door finished closing. The lock sighed like an old priest, and the hinges counted my steps. The precinct fortress was a mouth, and I was on the tongue. Walls wore prayers stamped in lead and smeared with thumb grease. Servo skulls buzzed in attendance like dutiful flies. Their eye lenses tracked me with insect affection. One skull dribbled ink from a quill tongue and signed the air with my designation. The letters hung there for a heartbeat like gnats pinned to glass. A lumen strip flickered and decided to hate me on principle. The arbites released me into the custody of an adept whose robe looked like it had been boiled in parchment. He smelled of vellum and cold tea. His augmetic fingers clicked like abati beads, shifting toward a foregone conclusion. He gestured, and I followed because gravity does not negotiate. The intake hall stretched like a ledger that never balances. Benches were bolted to the floor with the confidence of conviction. Cages divided the space into problems and solutions. Pict casters mounted in cherub casings watched with prim disapproval. A steel line on the floor told me where to stand. I stood on it and became a measurement. A valve hissed and sprayed me with delousing vapor that smelled of burnt lemons and old socks. Powder settled on my scalp and found each remaining hair as if to memorize it. A servitor with many hands and fewer thoughts descended on me in a cloud of efficiency. One hand took my belt, one took my boots, one took the small cloth pouch where I kept 2 washers and a bent nail for luck. Luck rusts quickly under fluorescent light. Another hand passed a magnifier over my scar and made a note that I could not see. They catalogued me the way a museum catalogues a bone, no longer sure which animal deserved it. A bell chimed for some other soul, but my body flinched on schedule. The adept asked my name and did not wait for me to finish saying it. He asked my designation and nodded before the last digit left my tongue. He asked my function, and wrote maintenance like an accusation that had finally learned to spell itself. He asked about kin, and I told him their names like prayer beads clicking through years. He wrote deceased without blinking. A Medici servo on rails glided near with the bedside manner of a guillotine. It sampled my blood and scolded it with antiseptic. A needle tasted the inside of my cheek for contraband biology. A strip of litmus scraped my tongue and decided whether my sins were pharmacological or merely human. An auspex wreath settled on my brow and hummed until my thoughts lined up for inspection. The hum found a minor lift where the air bent around me. The adept murmured resonance minor, and the room quietly sharpened its knives. A catechism slate was pressed into my hands and began dictating obedience in 4-part harmony. The hymn looped until meaning wore thin and only rhythm remained. I tried to return the slate, and it stuck to my palms with static and duty. The robe-smelling adept led me to a frame door labeled Verification. Inside, light pooled like mercy and then retracted at my approach. A picked capture rig sat like a spider with cables for legs. I stood on a brass plate inlaid with numbers that did not add up to anything I wanted. The spider blinked at me in triplicate. A female voice from a Vox grill asked me to remove my shirt with all the warmth of a glacier. I obeyed and felt smaller by the surface area of cloth. Cold lenses slid across my torso and counted moles as if they were heresies incubating sermons. The machine spat out transparency slips with my outline repeated in diminishing faith. An assistant adept caught them as if they were fragile saints in need of rescue. He filed them in a folder made of some animal that had trusted the wrong universe. A servo arm applied a branding press to the cuff of my issued sleeve. The numbers glowed with an obedient heat. The smell was tallow and consequences. A second brand, smaller and hidden, kissed the inside of my left wrist. It was the size of a coin and as heavy. The adept called it a contact seal and did not elaborate. When I asked what it keyed, his human mouth made the shape of later, and the conversation ended. We moved to a bench with straps that pretended to be friendly. A truth engine sat opposite me with candles at its feet. The candles were in little cages, as if flame might run if left unobserved. The truth engine wore purity seals like a saint wears arrows. It had a panel where a needle danced when lies tried to waltz. A scribe servitor loaded a page that had already decided not to forgive me. The adept folded his thin hands and asked me to breathe. He told me the engine liked honest breath. The needle quivered like a nervous bird. He asked me simple things first, and the needle learned my baseline. Name, designation, sector, faith. I said the words the primer taught me, and the engine purred. He eased into questions that felt like sand under the eyelids. Did I know anyone who dreamt loudly? Did I know anyone who hid books? Did I know anyone who smiled when the power failed? The needle ticked with tiny excitements. I learned which parts of me rusted sooner. He asked what I thought when I heard sacred service. I said pride and fear, and the needle sighed like it had eaten well. He asked what I would do to keep the light burning. I said anything, and discovered the size of that word when the engine leaned toward me like an attentive dog. We paused while a servitor emptied a tray of my sweat into a vial for future scholarship. The adept offered water with a cup that had already been forgiven for everything it would see. The water remembered pipes older than my parents. He asked about dreams, and I told him the ones safe enough for daylight. I omitted the one with the black tide and the lighthouse of teeth. The needle did not let me omit it. It tapped the panel with unseemly enthusiasm. He wrote minor resonance twice and underlined once. He asked me to read a line from the primer to establish textual loyalty. I read about the Emperor's watchful mercy, and my voice tripped on mercy and had to be coaxed back. He had me copy a passage with a quill that drank blood more efficiently than I do. It pricked my finger with the tact of a tax collector. The ink glowed and then dried as if choosing a side. A second Medica unit took my pulse with a clamp that murmured a litany to the artery spirit. The clamp loosened when the prayer finished, and not a moment before. They measured my reflexes with a hammer whose head bore a tiny skull wearing spectacles. My knee jerked, and the skull nodded, and someone stamped acceptable on a slate. They weighed me and weighed my words and weighed my staring. An archivist with a voice like a library ladder asked a genealogy of questions and harvested my answers for grafting onto a tree I would never be allowed to sit under. A junior adept placed a small cage over my right hand and instructed me not to think of fear. The cage buzzed and warmed and revealed that I had thought of fear immediately and in detail. She made a note with a stylus that had been sharpened on other men. A scanner arm swept my skull and paused at the scar. It whispered to itself in Bin Harik, and the adept shushed it as if it were a child in a sermon. A purity check followed with oils that smelled like thunder learning to be polite. The oil traced the sign of the aquila on my brow and flared a moment when it crossed the place where headaches sleep. The sister from the corridor appeared briefly and laid 2 fingers on the symbol. Heat wandered inward like a pilgrim unsure of the shrine. She said nothing, and the air behaved better while she stood there. The robe-smelling adept returned with a tray of tokens that looked like coins bitten by saints. Each token bore a glyph that disapproved of warmth. He pressed one against the brand at my wrist, and it sang a note so high it seemed to come from the possibility of sound rather than the fact of it. He nodded and wrote bonded. He pressed a second token to my sternum, and the hymn from the catechism. Slate slid into my bones as if finding its true address. The hymn promised obedience would be recognized as a kind of cleverness. I considered arguing and decided my breath was better spent elsewhere. We moved to another station where a cogitator asked me to arrange little wooden saints by height and sin. I did poorly at sin and well at height. A different cogitator asked me to finish equations that looked like prayers that had forgotten the words and remembered only the pattern. I balanced sums and felt briefly competent. The machine rewarded me by asking what sacrifice meant when the subject did not give consent. I said duty. The machine printed maybe. They cut my hair down to intention. The clippers chewed through strands with an appetite that bordered on gratitude. A dusting servitor brushed the clippings into a brass urn etched with my designation. Nothing is allowed to be merely trash in a fortress that worships accountancy. They scraped beneath my nails with a tool that sang about purity in a cheerful voice. It found oil and history and a tiny splinter from a crate I had carried 2 years ago. The splinter went into a vial with a label as long as a confession. I signed a page I could not read because it spoke legal from a century I would never visit. The adept told me it was a declaration that I had been treated with the exact amount of respect allocated by my destiny. I said the sentence back to him so he could hear how it sounded from my mouth. He did not flinch, so I learned nothing. A vox cherub delivered a tray with a bowl of ration stew and a spoon that doubled as a mirror for the small. The stew tasted competent. The spoon made me look like a warning about fatigue. I ate because hunger is the last loyalty to leave. The catechism slate brightened to remind me that obedience digests better than doubt. I swallowed and pretended to agree. They issued me a grey shift with my number stitched at the heart where people used to keep saints. They issued me paper slippers that flapped like a counterfeit prayer. They issued me a strip of cloth to use as a towel and a promise that water happens to the deserving. A final station waited with a chair carved to resemble patience. I sat and a soft circlet settled across my temples like a crown that had given up on jewels. The circlet vibrated, and a ghostly image of my thoughts appeared on a slate, as peaks and troughs that wanted to be mountains and wanted to be graves. The adept adjusted a knob labeled discretion, and the peaks calmed, as if embarrassed to be noticed. He tuned me the way a mechanic tunes a rattle out of a faithful engine. He asked me to repeat my name until it felt foreign, and then to repeat my designation until it felt true. The designation sat more comfortably with each recital. The name tried to leave by the nearest exit. I held it with my teeth, and the copper came back and approved my effort. A bell rang somewhere with bureaucratic certainty. Shift change flowed through the hall like a tide of parchment and metal. New adepts replaced old adepts with the frictionless grace of a diagram. A servitor collected the pages that contained the first draft of my new self. It carried them away with tenderness that unsettled me more than negligence would have. I caught a glimpse of the top sheet and saw the words Citizen Voss, followed by a string of numbers that had acquired opinions. Beneath it was a line that only said suitable. A different hand had annotated it with 3 small squares filled in like little graves. A young clerk approached with a tray of seals and wires and a smile that had been filed to professional smoothness. She pinned a wafer seal to my collarbone with a prick of ritual. She threaded a thin wire through the brand at my cuff and tied it into a knot whose geometry suggested it would keep its promise. She whispered the machine god's briefest favor, and for a moment the air admired me. The robe-smelling adept returned and asked me to state my crimes. I said I had not been accused. He nodded and corrected me with precision. He said I had been measured. He said measurement reveals a shape the law can recognize. He asked again, and I listed the small rebellions that make a life livable. Late shifts where I took 5 minutes back from a clock that had stolen hours. Jokes about quotas spoken softly beside loud machines. A prayer left unsaid when the foreman's back was turned. A book once read that was not on the list and afterward returned to its hiding place with an apology. The truth engine made a contented sound, like a cat learning it was never a cat at all. The adept wrote acceptable deviation and drew a narrow circle around it. He underlined resonance minor and boxed it as if it required careful handling. He stamped a sigil on the page that I felt bruise my future. He told me a cell would be assigned. He said the word cell as one might say room or calling. He recited a list of rules that all translated to, do not remind the walls you are meat. A door irised open and revealed a corridor paved with choices I did not get to make. A pair of custodian statues flanked the exit and pretended not to care about a man like me. Their eyes were blank stone that remembered when it had been mountain. A vox announced numbers, and every number found a throat. My number found mine with the accuracy of a bolt round finding a heart that had volunteered. I stood because obedience had already grown its roots. The adept gestured with the bored grace of someone who can see the next 100 steps, and none of them involve surprise. I stepped, because step had been the first litany the cuffs taught me. The catechism slate brightened, and began a new hymn about preparation being a form of love. The door ahead sighed like a book that knows the ending and refuses to spoil it. The corridor waited with the patience of a patient hunter that loves statistics. I moved forward and became the thing statistics had been planning for. The cell introduced itself with geometry. 3 paces by 3. Great underfoot that gave my weight a language it could not refuse. A single lumen resting in the ceiling like a pale and patient eye. Walls the color of old paper that has learned to hold its breath. A drain in one corner that smelled faintly of penitence and bleach. A hatch that could be a mouth or a mercy depending on its mood. The door had no handle and a memory for footsteps. Every time I shifted my stance, the floor answered with a small metallic opinion. A vox grill lived beside the lumen like a throat embedded in a skull. It whispered prayers with bureaucratic diction. Each syllable an inventory of virtue, each pause a place for guilt to sit down. Between prayers it asked questions. Simple at first. Name, designation, faith. Then the kind that have hooks behind the words. Who laughs when sermons run long? Who keeps a book beneath a floorboard that squeaks differently on cold mornings? Who hums in the absence of power as if silence needs encouragement? I answered with caution and catalogued the shape of my caution. Somewhere invisible, another machine counted the hesitations and made a modest prophecy. I learned the tempo of the corridor outside. Arbite's boots were a metronome with anger for a pendulum. Robes whispered like obedient fire. Servitor treads hummed an endless middle note that shaved thoughts smooth. My pulse found those rhythms and negotiated. The lumen never dimmed at first. It shaved sleep into filings and fed them to the drain. I tried to lie on the cot and discovered it was a table that accepted supplicants. The blanket was a suggestion woven from apology. I folded it along its creases because the lines felt like orders written for cloth. The air was cool and suspicious and tasted of ions and patience. I licked my lips and found salt that did not belong to me. The walls had scratches at knee height, marks you make when you need days to exist in a row. I counted them and found an arithmetic that ended before it wanted to. My hands shook and then practiced stillness the way a novice practices a blade drill. A red dot appeared on the wall and tracked my breath as if it were a small animal worth study. When I held my breath, the dot brightened. When I exhaled too quickly, the dot dimmed reprimandingly. The door breathed in and out with seals that tasted the corridor and decided it was unfit to visit. When the hatch hissed open, the bowl slid through like a shy planet. Steam carried the smell of starch and everything else that had been removed for efficiency. Beside it, a cup of water that might have once seen a mountain. I ate because hunger is a religion you join without paperwork. The spoon was stamped with an aquila so thin it felt like a flirtation with treason. I scraped the bowl and heard someone in the next cell scrape the same music. We were a duet for people who would never meet. After the meal, the Vox asked me to recite. The catechism slate from processing had not followed me, but the words had. Obedience, sacrifice, light. I gave them back in order because order bargains better than improvisation. A fine grid of heat passed across my face, as if a tiny sunrise had been rolled over me on rails. The grid searched and found a tremor, and made a note I could feel but not read. The first visit arrived with the softness of a new cloth. 2 Arbites and a man in plain black. No sigils visible, no cruelty displayed. Kindness arranged neatly like surgical instruments. He sat on a chair that unfolded from to the wall with a sound like restraint practicing to be furniture. He said his name quietly, and then removed it from the room by the way he never used it again. He kept his hands visible and his eyes gentle, and his questions arranged like steps. Do you sleep? Do you dream? Do you remember numbers better than faces, or faces better than names? He asked about the wheats and the wheels and the quiet songs machines sing when they are not watched. He asked about chapel attendance and which lines of the primer I mouthed and which lines I skipped to catch up with the hymn. He asked if I had ever touched a relic and felt it notice me. He laughed when I said no, and his laugh was warm enough to thaw the fear I had sharpened. Then he offered me a quill. It was a beautiful thing with veins of gold and a nib that pulsed faintly like a living thorn. He pricked my finger with ritual apology, and the quill drank the droplet without shame. Write what you know to be true. I wrote my name until the letters became fencing. I wrote my designation until the numbers stopped being numbers and started being a room I could navigate with my eyes closed. I wrote that my parents were dead, and my hands were good, and my thoughts were sometimes unkind, yet not treasonous. The quill approved of honesty and hummed. Write what might be true. The words arrived like animals that will not be tamed but will eat from your hand if you stand very still. I wrote that sacred service might be beautiful. I wrote that sacred service might be a mouth that says thank you while it bites. I wrote that I might be afraid for reasons larger than myself. He leaned forward with sympathy carefully measured. He told me fear was proof of awareness, and awareness was a kind of tithe. He took the page and pressed it flat with his palm, and the ink darkened as if pleased to be touched. He did not show me the rosette, but I felt the outline of it in the courtesy of his voice. He asked about names. He let them drift into the air and settle only if I offered them. I offered none, and learned how to offer none more convincingly. He asked about dreams again, and did not blink when I described gears taller than houses turning without teeth. He asked what sound the void makes in lungs that have only ever known recycled air. I said coins and cold perfume, and a choir humming through a closed door. He asked about the day I first saw an arbeit. He asked about the day I first realized the emperor was not an idea, but a pressure. He asked about the day I first lied, and the day I first liked it. The lumen flickered once, and steadied as if embarrassed by its own honesty. He left me with a prayer written on a thin strip of copper. He set it on the cot, and the metal remembered the shape of a liturgy. After the door closed, the strip warmed briefly against my palm, and then cooled to the temperature of duty. The cell resumed its study. The vox hush changed to a straining silence, like a listener leaning toward a whisper it does not want to miss. A line of tiny lenses iris opened in the corner and looked at the soles of my feet. I lifted each foot one at a time to satisfy their appetite. I tried to sleep, and the lumen made no promises. Instead, it sang a frequency that asked my bones to confess. I lay on my back and counted bolts in the vent. 30, 31, if you count the one that has learned to pretend it is a shadow. The air throbbed with machines buried deep enough to be mistaken for geology. I found myself timing my breaths to the deeper hum so that we would not argue. When my throat dried, the wall extruded a steel cup with the same lack of ceremony with which a tree offers a leaf to gravity. The water appeared in it in a thin, patient pour. I drank, and the cup retreated with a sniff. Condensation beaded above the hatch and sketched a map of something that moved about 2 levels below. I memorized the map, because maps occupy hands that might otherwise tremble. At some hour that had been taken off the clock to avoid clutter, the lumen dimmed. Not to darkness, to doctrine. Exactly 14 heartbeats of mercy, like a coin tossed to a beggar by a statue. In that almost dark, the room changed. The cell stopped pretending to be a room and revealed it had organs. Heat moved across the floor in veins. The grate found the rhythm of my pulse and drummed it back to me with small corrections. My name felt heavier, as if letters attract gravity when no one is looking. I understood the warning and turned my head a fraction. The dark gave back the sound of my hair against rough pillow cotton and kept the rest for later. When the lumen restored itself, I felt catalogued to a new decimal place. The 14 beats returned again in a cycle I could not predict, and I learned to breathe through them as through a cold wave. Another visit arrived, and this time the plain black man did not sit. He leaned in the doorway and let the corridor smell of oil and authority pour around him like a second robe. He asked fewer questions, and watched the answers arrive in my posture. He taught me a trick for calming the truth engine that lived behind the wall by reciting a line from the primer backwards. I failed twice and succeeded once, and the engine rewarded me with a softened whine. He asked what I thought about the word confession. I said it was a bridge you build so the enemy doesn't have to. He smiled without showing teeth and left a strip of salted ration on the cot. My mouth watered, and my gratitude made me suspicious. I ate it slowly and decided suspicion tastes like everything else if you chew long enough. The Vox changed languages and asked me questions in Binharik. I did not answer in Binharik, but my pulse tried. The red dot became 3 red dots and choreographed them across the wall like spores searching for a damp place to root. In the next cell, a woman sobbed and then recited dates in a cadence that suggested she was being graded. I tapped my knuckle against the grate once to say, alive. Silence answered with professional distance. A different servo visited. It looked like a lamp with aspirations. It extended a tiny brush and scrubbed the brand at my cuff clean as if clarity were a disinfectant. It left a seal on the wall that shimmered when I looked at it, and sulked when I did not. My stomach learned the timetable of the hatch, but the hatch did not learn my stomach. Sometimes the bowl arrived late and taught the lesson of patience with competent cruelty. Sometimes it arrived early and taught the lesson of distrust in generosity. Once it did not arrive, and the day continued anyway. I learned to press my ear against the wall and hear rotas being spoken in voices that believed they were rocks. I learned to tell the difference between a batten's knock and a data rod's introduction. I learned that the cell preferred me upright. When I sat too long, the grate warmed my thighs with a corrective maternalism. When I stood too still, the air cooled my ankles until movement became an argument I did not want to lose. On the 3rd or 30th hour, the plain black man returned with a slate. He offered it like medicine. On it were questions arranged as diagrams that pretended to be neutral. Place yourself on this path where obedience bends into choice. Place yourself on this path where choice bends into obedience. I pointed without thinking and saw his eyebrows arrange themselves into a shape an artist might call interesting. He spoke then of purpose the way a ship speaks, of course, not as a suggestion. As the only line that prevents the sea from eating you for being imprecise. He asked me whether light belongs to those who tend it or to those who need it. He asked me whether a key can be blamed for the door. He asked me whether fear is a loan or a tithe. He asked me what I would do with a kindness that knew my measurements. I answered and heard the cell nod. I did not know a room could nod, but I felt the approval in the way the lumen settled a fraction closer to gentleness. That night, the 14 heartbeats came twice in a row. In the almost dark, I felt the cell notice my attention noticing it. The sensation was not hostility, it was interest. The same interest a craftsman feels when he looks at a piece of metal and wonders how many shapes live inside it. I lay very still and let the cell decide I was patient material. The drain hiccuped and breathed in. Somewhere beneath us, a pump chanted a prayer to pressure. I whispered a line from the primer for no one. I replaced a word with my name and heard the room make a small adjustment as if to say correct. When the lumen brightened, the vox began again with questions folded into blessings. It asked what gratitude feels like in the mouth. It asked where sorrow sits when the body is busy. It asked whether silence is a weapon or a wound. I answered with my pulse, and the red dots found the rhythm and wrote it down in arithmetic I could not see. The hatch opened, and a different bowl arrived. This one carried a taste I recognized from the manufactorum when shipments went missing and recipes were adjusted by necessity. Corpse starch flavored with nostalgia. I ate until the memory quieted down. A handprint ghosted on the wall near the floor where the scratches were. In certain angles of lumen, it looked fresh. I pressed my own hand there and felt the temperature fail to change. I left my hand until it ached. The ache reminded me that time still passed in places fingers could count. I began to mark the length of prayers by the distance a drop of condensation traveled before it chose the hatch. I began to mark the length of mercy by the duration of the 14 heartbeats when they came. I stayed ready for footsteps because footsteps held the shape of the next question. I stayed ready for the kind man and the unkind lumen and the cell that thought and the drain that liked the taste of conclusions. I stayed ready because readiness is a door that always opens inward. They brought us out in chains that remembered all the wrists they had educated. Each link clicked like a bead on a rosary that had learned arithmetic. The chains spoke in vox whispers when they moved, and the words were small litanies with sharp edges. Step. Obey. Endure. I tasted iron and dust, and the memory of incense burned down to a bitter knot. The corridor to embarkation narrowed until it taught the lesson of shoulders. Skitarii stood at intervals like punctuation marks in a sentence you dare not misread. Their augmetic eyes shone with the polite cruelty of precise tools. A red-robed adept counted us with a staff that crackled when it approved. He murmured to the door, and the door answered in a dialect of locks. Beyond the mouth of the fortress, a docking arm stretched like a limb fitted with scars that knew the weather. The void ship waited with the patience of something that had already outlived the men who forged it. Its hull loomed like a continent that had chosen to move. A brass aquila watched from the prow with the hunger of empire. We crossed the gantry in a file that refused to be a procession, and failed. Below us fuel burned in blue tongues and made the air taste like coins licked by old children. The gantry flexed with a sound like a sermon bending to fit a new sin. I kept my eyes on the painted line and my thoughts on the distance between footfalls. To either side, the hive fell away in layers of masonry and prayer and forgotten scaffolds that had decided to become ribs. A bell tolled from the ship's spine, and every chain answered in minor harmony. We passed under wards etched in metal that held their breath as we crossed. A priest in threadbare vestments shook a thurible, and smoke drew maps that warned nothing and meant everything. He flicked holy water at our brows, and the droplets stung as if truth has vinegar in it. A commissar's aide paced beside us with a stack of slates and a gaze like a drawn bolt. Her cap's red piping sliced the air into permitted shapes. She marked each of us with a stylus that enjoyed its work. Penal, servitor, indenture, measured. Her mouth barely moved when she spoke. The categories moved the world. The blank passed near, and the air forgot how to be familiar. My thoughts stumbled on smooth ground and came away offended. The blank's presence sanded the edges off my fear and left it featureless and very large. The Arbites avoided him with the superstition of experienced men. A boy 2 chains ahead began to hum a primer hymn and forgot the melody halfway through his second breath. His lips kept moving like a prayer wheel grinding without grease. We reached an embarkation moor where the deck sloped down and light thinned into a more obedient tone. Bulkhead saints frowned from niches and carried wounds like medals. A vox announced a boarding rubric that sounded like mathematics trying to be compassionate. We filed past a station where our chains were weighed and our offenses were remeasured until they fit the hold's furniture. A rating with tattoos like maps of lost coasts clipped a tally counter with each of us who passed. He did not look at faces, and in this he was merciful. The black holds began where the ship decided it did not owe comfort. Light existed there as an accusation and a ration. The air was cool and metallic and crowded by breath that had failed to become prayers. cages weighted like teeth with a sense of humor. Each cage knew a number and liked it. We were fed into them the way components meet slots, with a click that reassures the machine. The floor trembled in nervous anticipation of the future. Some cages already had occupants, and the occupants had learned to look at the opposite wall. A man with an explosive collar cradled his head, as if it might roll off if left unattended. The collar had a tiny lumen that blinked a rhythm I could not decide was comfort or menace. Across from him, a woman wore a steel torque that made the air wrinkle as it passed. Her eyes were tired in a way that suggested all eyes tire eventually. A servitor with a broom for one hand and a data needle for the other tidied the corridor with religious disdain. Its vox repeated, "Spill containment is virtue," until the words softened at the corners. A priest of the ship leaned into each cage long enough to push a stamp against our foreheads. The stamp left no mark that light could see, but I felt catalogued in a new tense. He whispered the names of saints who died by waiting. He told us that endurance is speed measured correctly. He told us that the Emperor's gaze is a pressure best aligned with. I nodded, because nodding does not require belief. The hatch slammed and reinvented silence. The chain litanies calmed into an aftertaste. Bars introduced themselves to fingers that had not requested acquaintances. The corridor beyond echoed with preparation that felt like prayer overheard through walls. Rivets ticked as the hull relaxed into the idea of flight. Somewhere a pump negotiated with Void and made promises on our behalf. The ship shuddered as clamps argued with letting go. A klaxon coughed itself awake and gave us instructions we already knew. Brace. Obey. Do not look for windows where none are permitted. The Geller field test made the hair on my arms rise, as if truth had entered and found the room untidy. Static crawled over the bars and nested briefly in my teeth. A rating shouted a litany to the field's machine spirit, and the words rattled down the corridor like bolts in a tray. Someone laughed 3 cages away, and then apologized to no one. I watched the blank sit with hands folded like a monk's. The space around him wore a low hum that did not coordinate with the ship. I tried not to look, and failed, and he did not look back, and I was grateful. The commissar's aide walked the line with her stylus and her list, and the temperature set itself to her expectations. She paused at my cage and read my category. Measured. Her mouth made a small shape that could have been pity, or could have been the flex before a yawn. She asked whether I knew how to be still. I said I had worked beside industrial augurs that taught patience as a survival skill. She marked a square and moved on, and the air felt permitted to move again. The clamps released with a sigh that sounded like a giant deciding to forgive a hill. The rumble built and rolled and climbed until it grew past hearing and lived in bone. We lifted into the throat of the sky, and the hive unfolded below like a confession written in masonry. No view was granted, but the tilt of gravity told stories you could learn to read. I felt the city leave the soles of my feet and be replaced by the ship. The ship accepted us as weight, and not yet as purpose. A bell tolled again, and the second tone was thicker, as if dipped in oil. The priest returned and threaded the corridor with smoke and syllables. He prayed for seals and welds and men who forget fear at useful times. He prayed for the navigator's eye to remain a door and not a mouth. He prayed for the Geller field to remember patience longer than the sea remembers hunger. We crossed the edge where air believes it is alone. The hull groaned like a cathedral, taught a new hymn too quickly. In that moment, I understood that ships are temples that move, and temples are ships that pretend not to. The field engaged fully, and the world sharpened around the edges. My stomach took inventory and misplaced several items. The boy with the failed hymn leaned forward and retched nothing onto the deck. A servitor arrived with a bucket and affectionless efficiency. The void has a taste, and it is the taste of metal learning how to be forever. The commissar herself strode past once with her coat like a sentence, and her eyes like punctuation that ends arguments. She did not look at any of us, and all of us looked at her and were reassured against our will. A rating brought ration bricks and slid them through hatches with the brisk tenderness of a mortician who enjoys neatness. The bricks tasted of starch and memory, and the faint ghost of protein had a uniform. We ate because hunger is the only discipline that does not require teaching. The cage opposite held a man with a pilgrim's brand shaped like a thorn crown. He whispered a route through constellations that no longer existed. His lips made maps that folded when the ship flexed. He told me without looking that the field sings too loud the first day, and then the ears surrender. He told me that once he heard the field falter, and he has lived in silence ever since. I asked if we were on a black ship. He smiled as if I had asked whether water is wet, and whether wet is faithful. He said, "All ships are black when you close your eyes and trust." A tech adept shuffled down the corridor with incense braziers hung from both shoulders like contrition. His mechadendrites stroked the bars and left behind little sparks that looked like approving gnats. He paused at the blank and made a sign in the air that meant nothing to me and everything to him. The blank's expression did not change, and gratitude did not enter the room. The deck juddered as Macro Cannon ran a test that comforted men who would never touch the triggers. The sound arrived like a sermon shouted through the lungs of a beast. The cages thrummed in sympathy, and each of us imagined briefly a battle we would not be asked to fight. A siren moaned 3 notes and stopped as if embarrassed by its own drama. The priest returned with a squad of crew whose uniforms had acquired grease as a second sacrament. They knelt and pressed their foreheads to the deck and thanked it for not hating them. One of them slipped a small cog-tooth charm through my bars and told me to think of smooth meshing when fear clicked. I closed my hand on it and felt the discipline of machines like a cool river through the palm. Shift cycles began to structure themselves around the idea of survival. Lights in the corridor dimmed to penitent and brightened to dutiful. The Geller field throb counted our breaths when we forgot to. I learned the voices of the ship, the whisper of coolant in arteries that never clot, the regulated sigh of life support as it decides we are worth the effort, the piping chatter of maintenance cherubs telling each other where the leaks live and whom they married. In the distance, something heavy turned with the right amount of reluctance. The cages had gutters that drank wash water and regret with equal thirst. Sometimes the gutters talked back in bubbles, and you could swear they were saying names. I pressed my ear to the bars and caught the thin music of hymnals in a chapel 3 decks away. It was the melody of men convincing light to stay by complimenting it. The commissar's aide returned with her slates and read out assignments like fates drawn from a mechanical urn. Penal Legion details were routed to a compartment at the bow where courage could be measured quickly. Servitor coffles were led aft, where identity cools and hardens into utility. Indentures were tallied for transfers to machine shrines that grow their own weather. Measured, weighted, and watched and practiced calm as a skill you could hold in the mouth like a coin. The boy with the failed hymn asked me what measured meant. I said it meant an answer someone else could use. He nodded, as if relieved to be useful, and then shut his eyes, as if weathering an eclipse. The blank stood when no one told him to, and sat when no one ordered it, and time took notes. Crew passed sometimes with lasgun slings, and faces like doors that only open at passwords. They looked at us with the careful indifference of men who work beside dynamos. They know the rules and never forget what happens when rules are mistaken for furniture. A sister hospitaller walked the corridor once, and the air tried to be cleaner. She paused and touched 2 fingers to my brand and whispered a line about endurance being a bright color if the light is right. Her gauntlet was cool, and the warmth she left behind felt like a promise I would not hold her to. A null maiden came later like a shadow that owned its darkness instead of renting it. Even the blank shifted as she passed, as if gravity had asked for a quiet word. Her mask stared at the future, and the future did not return the courtesy. The ship's navigator announced a course correction in a voice that arrived through bulkheads as taste more than sound. I tasted copper and olives, and a map with 2 fewer stars. I felt our path kink like a rope refusing a knot, and then relax as new calculations found purchase. Someone 2 cages down began to giggle on an offbeat, and a medici servitor arrived with a needle that expected gratitude. The giggling folded into sleep, and the servitor collected it as if it were evidence. The priest returned with a portable icon that flickered in the edges and steadied when he sang. He pressed it against each cage, and the cage sighed without moving. When he pressed it to the blank spars, the icon dimmed politely and tried to remember another job. A rating told me in a whisper that ports are loud, and the void is louder, and the warp is loudest, but here in the hold we only learn the harmonies. He said the warp song lives under everything like mildew. He said you learn to hum along or you grow mushrooms in your skull. I asked if he had hums he recommended, and he laughed in a way that made the ship tilt toward him slightly. We slept in shifts that no clock acknowledged. We dreamed the same dream from different angles. A lighthouse that was also a needle, a sea that was also a mouth, a shore that was also a sentence we could not diagram. When I woke, the cage had left imprints on my arms that looked like handwriting. I could not read them and felt fortunate. The commissar's boots passed and discipline straightened the air. She paused somewhere I could not see, and the silence ahead of her arranged itself. A penal man coughed and concealed a prayer inside the cough, and earned the mercy of being ignored. The ship executed a burn, and all of us leaned as if to help. I felt the structure drink thrust and distribute it like a careful parent. I wondered how many men had been born on ships and died on ships and never seen sky that was not a ceiling. I wondered whether that was better for them in the long arithmetic. The boy with the failed hymn asked if the emperor could see into the hold. I said the emperor can see into places light cannot and shame will not. He nodded and placed his hand on the bars as if to offer his pulse as evidence. The rations changed flavor to celebrate a holy day I did not know. They tasted briefly of something that once had bones. The priest told us the day's name, and half of us repeated it correctly on the first try. The other half learned, and no one was punished because the lesson fit into the hold's curriculum. I saw through a crack in the bulkhead a panel of Picts that cycled through faces and stars, and the face of a star that had been asked to be a god for a century, and had failed beautifully. The panel reset and showed a deck plan with our compartment marked in a color that meant contained. A tech adept patted the panel like a pet and called it obedient. The odor of machine oil thickened and then thinned as if it too took a breath. I held the cog tooth charm and imagined meshing, and imagined the warm astonishment of 2 teeth meeting exactly. I counted the beats of the Geller field and learned which beat belonged to me and which belonged to everyone else. I listened for a falter and promised to outlive it by exactly 1 breath. I watched the blank watch nothing and be watched by everything. I heard the commissar's aide recite casualties from a previous voyage, as if memory were a tax. I learned the names of crew by the way their steps talked. The man with the pilgrim brand taught me a trick for sleeping when the field's hum aligned with a childhood fever. You breathe on the off-beat and offer the on-beat to someone you owe. I offered it to my parents and to a grinding wheel with a hairline crack I had coaxed back to loyalty. A bell chimed the hour of something, and the priest responded with smoke. The cages sweated and then dried, and the deck squeaked in small apologies. We passed into a region where even the crew crossed themselves with whatever sign their hands remembered. The void pressed harder, and the field pressed back with kindness that had a cost. The commissar's coat whispered, and men stood straighter inside their bones. A siren chirped, and the bulkhead glyph for brace blinked as if shy. A wave of wrongness washed through, and I tasted salt in a universe that has forgotten oceans. The blank smiled in a way that looked exactly like not smiling. The wave passed and left a smear of echo that the priest mopped up with syllables. I realized I was counting the number of times the ship blinked, and that ships that blink are doing their best. The aide returned and called for volunteers from categories that do not usually ask for volunteers. 2 men stepped forward because stepping backward was not an available motion. They were taken to a side compartment, and their chains gleamed with relevance. We listened and heard nothing of consequence, and this was the most consequential thing we could have heard. The macro cannon tested again, and the ship answered with a posture you would not expect from metal. A rating told a joke about sailors and saints, and the punchline was a bolt round discharged safely into a barrel of sand. We laughed because laughter keeps lungs practiced for oxygen. The commissar did not laugh, and oxygen remained available. A Medici unit painted our mouths with an astringent blessed for immunity against long voyages and short tempers. It tasted like a forest that remembers it used to be a man. I closed my eyes and listened to the hold practice being a choir. Shackles kept time, and chains provided percussion, and every heartbeat found a harmony whether it wanted to or not. The priest conducted with the slow confidence of someone who has ferried souls along this road enough to know where it floods. The navigator's voice returned as a flavor of iron cooled in shadow. "Course correction approved. Transit maintained. Eyes open." I did not have an eye like his, but I kept mine open because the order felt generous. The boy with the failed hymn slept at last, and his breathing learned the rhythm that had been looking for him. The blank did not sleep in a way I could recognize, and the rest of us pretended that was a comfort. The ship settled into a long exhale that suggested we were where we needed to be for now. The cages shivered less, and the lumen learned a softer discipline. A tech adept returned and traced sigils on the bars that tickled skin like small schools of fish that have been told to be reverent. He told us the machine spirit prefers calm flesh. He told us panic is sand in the gears. He told us gratitude is grease with a longer shelf life. I said thank you in my head and felt the tiniest improvement in the hinge closest to my cheek. The commissar's aide made one last pass and looked at me as if deciding whether I fit a future slot. She wrote something short that meant everything, and the slate did not share. The priest banked the braziers, and the smoke curled into questions it did not intend to answer. The deck vibrated with the tread of decisions moving closer. The chain at my wrist repeated its litany in a whisper that had learned my pulse. Step. Obey. Endure. I pressed the cogtooth into my palm until it printed a little constellation and waited for the next door to name itself. Judgment did not arrive with a gavel. It arrived with a corridor and 5 doors that watched us the way predators watch arithmetic. An adept in robes the color of old bone stood at a lectern bred from cables. He spoke our options as if reciting weather. His voice carried the dryness of a library that has eaten its last reader. He named each door without adjectives. He let the doors keep their own. The floor was inlaid brass, and the pattern resembled a map of choices the way veins resemble rivers. The air was cooler than mercy. The chains on our wrists clicked out punctuation while he read. I smelled hot oil dulled by incense and something sweet that refused to explain itself. Skitari flanked the corridor like statues that remembered rehearsal. A servo cherub held a slate skyward, and the slate glowed with our designations like stars that had learned obedience. We stood in rows that tried to be straight and failed on the edges where fear frays geometry. My tongue tasted copper as if decisions were a mouth's work. The adept raised a hand, and a hush moved over us like a soft lid. "Door 1, he said. "Penal Legion. Implantation of compliance device. Service until death or doctrinal redemption." He gestured, and the door answered by existing more loudly. Through the arch I saw an antechamber bright as a surgery invented by an enemy. Technicians wore aprons the color of promises kept too long. On a steel table lay a nest of explosive collars humming to themselves. Each collar bore a diode that blinked in rhythms tuned to compliance. Commissariat aides held clipboards like pistols. A priest oiled the collars as if feeding them. A tattooist touched a wand to a man's scalp and drew a small, numbered sun where hair had once claimed privacy. The man stared forward and swallowed without permission. A vox on the wall taught a song about courage that rhymed with shrapnel. The legionnaires who had already been judged moved with the care of men who know where their necks end. They signed a sheet with names that had been trimmed for speed. They passed a barrel of knuckle dusters and pity. They took the knuckle dusters and left the pity where it belonged. I watched a boy sign with a hand that shook and steady as a paradox. A commissar touched his shoulder and said, "Good soldier," in a tone that meant good instrument. The boy nodded, and the diode on his collar blinked twice like a heartbeat that had been taught manners. "Door 2, the adept said. "Servitorization. Cogitational harvest. Labor eternal within parameters." The door thrummed like a furnace learning to whisper. Inside, the ritual of unselfing wore gloves. Tables with restraints sat in ranks like pews. Medicimechs in quiet harness moved with the efficiency of erosion. A cranial drill purred like a domesticated predator. A sister of the cloth bent over a man and closed his eyes with 2 fingers as if tucking a child in before the storm. Litany strips hung from the lights and fluttered when the suction drew memories out. A tech priest read a checklist that began with identity and ended with warranty. The instruments smelled of spirits and iron and endings. A newly made servitor stood in the corner and practiced not existing between orders. Its mouth formed the shape of a word that had been removed. Its hands flexed as if remembering tools and forgetting fingers. A chime sounded, and an augmetic arm inked a barcode over a vein that no longer applied for leave. Someone whispered better than starving, and someone else whispered better than thinking, and both were telling the truth, designated for them. "Door 3, the adept said. "Indenture to the Adeptus Mechanicus. Debt labor in sanctified environments. Return contingent on accounts and survivability." The smell ran hot and metallic from that frame. Heat ghosted across the threshold in a wave that bowed my eyebrows. I saw a forge shrine widened by years of prayers that resembled maintenance. Crane spirits crawled overhead in patient choreography. Men and women in red work mantles signed contracts with pens that bit. The contracts wrote back when touched, figures busy as wasps. A foreman with a cog-tooth rosary set his palm against a furnace's flank and listened for temper. He nodded and shouted a number that sent riveters into action. Inductees stood on a line, while a servo thurible painted their lungs with anti-fume blessings. One coughed, and the blessing burned like pepper and lesson. Amagos with a jaw of brass fitted a new worker with a heat shroud collar and a pair of exo gloves whose knuckles were stamped with the machine god's patient face. He told her that pain is a gauge. He told her that when the gauge redlines, she should praise louder. A bell clanged 3 times for shift start, and the floor thrummed with energy that did not ask permission. "Door 4, the adept said. Ecclesiarchy repentance labor. Chant. Build. Bleed correctly. The space beyond breathed incense like an old memory, long aisles of stone, pallets of bricks that carried their own sermons. Repentance in grey marched in pairs, carrying blocks on shoulders rubbed raw and shining with discipline. A confessor walked along the column with a rod and a list and encouragement learned from hammers. He asked each penitent to name a fault and place a stone. He corrected posture the way a mason corrects a wall. Choir novices beat time on wooden boards with the ends of their palms. The rhythm remembered parade grounds and funerals with equal affection. Stations of the creed lined the walls in brass relief that made suffering seem tidy. A woman with chalk on her lips guided new arrivals to a font of cold water and colder questions. They drank and named their worst thought and spat the name into the drain with dignity. A sister dialogus tuned the chant like a lute until all the voices fit inside the corridor without fighting. Her mouth smiled and her eyes practiced accounting. She distributed scourges and soft cloths with equal professionalism. "Door 5, the adept said. The golden path. He did not translate. He did not need to. The expectation in the corridor tilted toward that frame as if the ship were a table with a glass near the edge. The air went thin and then organized. The blanks took position along the threshold like winter learning manners. Where they stood, the world remembered that noise is not mandatory. Sisters of silence moved with the liquid certainty of oiled blades. Their presence drew a border around each thought and held it for inspection. A tall woman in ash-white armor stood behind them with a helm under one arm and a rosary of trauma in the other hand. Her eyes measured capacity the way engineers measure span. A soul binder in golden threaded red waited beside a machine that breathed like a sleeping cathedral. Its surface crawled with runes that disliked attention. Racks of masks hung in rows like cold flowers waiting for faces. Cables hung from the ceiling like roots that had learned to harvest minds. The mask mouths were shut and hopeful. The soulbinder's attendants carried censers and clipboards and small knives wrapped in scripture. A Psychonar adept checked slates where waveforms plotted the architecture of fear. He nodded at some curves and frowned at others and wrote hunger or steady or breakage, likely with unhurried letters. My category on the aids slate said measured. Measured means useful where ratios matter. Measured means not nothing and not too much and sturdy where it counts. The adept at the lectern finished his enumeration and lowered his hand, and the hush looked around for another job. Assignment began without ceremony. Names called, numbers answered, feet moved toward futures. The penal men stepped through door 1 to the music of buckles. They learned the prayer that keeps a head near the rest of a body. They learned the gesture that means forgiveness at a range of 20 meters. One turned back and kissed the threshold, and the commissariat ignored the superstition because it did not slow the line. Those bound for servitorization walked as if gravity had agreed to be kinder for a few more steps. A medici touched each shoulder with a wand that sang a local anesthetic in a sad key. A tech priest thanked them for their meat and asked their names for record, and then referred to them as units with the professionalism of a storm. The indentured stepped into door 3, and a gust of heat took their hairline opinions and replaced them with equations about torque. They received chip keys on lanyards whose color told a crane where to put them if found unconscious. They signed a long column of boxes with a stylus that whispered a warning about fine print and debt compounding in the presence of faith. Repentants were led to door 4 with gentle hands that did not confuse gentleness with softness. A confessor smiled as if he had not slept and did not mind. He distributed bricks and blessings as if they were the same unit in different currencies. The chant rose and fell like a low tide that intends to return. Measured were held a moment more. The aide walked our line and examined faces the way an augur examines noise for messages. She stopped at me and read the annotations clawed beside my designation. She made a small sound that was not language and stepped aside. The soulbinder raised 2 fingers. My group peeled from the others with the reluctant grace of scabs. We crossed to door 5 between the nulls and felt thoughts slide in their sockets. Memory lost sharpness but gained honesty. My fear went grey and large and not personal. It settled on my shoulders like weather with a job. The ash-white sister touched the brand at my wrist and listened with her thumb. She said, "You will not break," and made it both prophecy and request. I answered by standing still. A Sycana adept held a strip of sanctified gold leaf and pressed it to my brow. It stuck the way a debt sticks. He wrote a sigil on it that tightened the air behind my eyes. He asked me to breathe, and his hand measured the exhale as if weighing thread. He nodded as if I were a knot that would hold a sail. We entered a preparation hall the color of thoughtful thunder. Benches, basins, icons covered in cloth muttering through the fabric. Attendants shaved our heads in practiced arcs that reminded me of lathe work. Hair fell in quiet spirals into bronze bowls etched with old optimism. An oil like rain on hot stone was rubbed into our scalps until the skin learned a new alphabet. Runes were painted on collarbones with brushes made from the zeal of animals. Each rune flickered briefly as if checking the room. A binder acolyte held up a mask for me to smell, and the scent was copper and relic, and a hint of citrus that felt like nostalgia for sunlight. "This will be yours," he said, and the mask failed to contradict him. It was a curved plate with lenses like dark coins and a mouth that knew several hymns. Cables coiled from its crown like snakes, drowsy with purpose. Behind the benches, a long window showed a choir chamber alive with patient machinery. Cradles waited in rings around a throne whose outline refused description. Servitors perched at consoles and blinked in unison when a bell commanded. On a dais, a choir mistress beat a slow measure with 2 lengths of bone, polished by generations of terrified fingers. Her sleeves were gilded where the cuffs met prayer. Her hair was white in a way that looked chosen. A wall of warding sigils glowed, as if moonlight had decided to be administrative. Closer to us, a physician of the mind pressed a cool disc to each temple in turn. He spoke my fear out loud, and it sounded smaller. He spoke my certainty out loud, and it sounded heavier. He asked how many breaths I could count while saying nothing in my head. I counted 12 before my mind invented a question. He wrote 12 and then a plus mark the way teachers do for children who might surprise them. A sister hospitaller inspected our palms as if destiny leaves fingerprints. She threaded a thin line through the brand at my cuff and tied it to a bead bracelet carved with liturgies that work best under pressure. She told me to pull 1 bead when doubt becomes louder than the machine. She told me each bead is a thought surviving a storm. I promised to be stingy. The blanks drifted near and prevented our panic from growing teeth. They stood like winter trees, that do not apologize for shade. One glanced at me, and the world made a soft click as if something slid into place. My heartbeat settled into a pattern that did not need my help. A tech priest approached with a wand of light that read more than blood. He passed it over my chest, and the wand murmured a number he liked. He stamped a wafer onto the skin beneath my collarbone, and heat spread like a tame lightning. "Sanctioned," he said, and the word climbed inside my ribs and sat there politely. A confessor came last with a bowl of water and a rag woven from old vows. He washed the oil from my eyelids and told me to look forward when the music begins. He told me to let the machine speak first and answer afterward in the smallest words I own. He told me that pain is a distraction and glory is a worse one. He told me that duty will carry me if I remember how to be carried. We were lined in pairs and given belts with rings for cables that do not forgive clumsiness. The belts rode the hips like honest burdens. We practiced walking while attached to nothing. We practiced stopping when the nulls lifted a hand. We practiced kneeling and not calling it that. Through the long window, the choir chamber deepened its light by a degree that suggested imminence. A bell chimed in a key I had never heard outside of rumors. A gust of cold passed along the floor like a scout. A servitor unrolled a scroll with my designation and pinned it to a board already crowded with names learning to be functions. I touched the cog tooth in my palm and felt its calm gear idea. The choir mistress looked toward our hall, and I felt noticed the way metal feels noticed by a magnet. The soul binder raised his hand, and the blanks shifted one pace, and the air corrected itself. The mask was placed in my hands, and it fit like a plan that had been waiting. The lenses held no reflection because reflection was not the point anymore. The cable couplings clicked when tested, and the sound was both question and answer. A sister checked the seals and nodded with the economy of someone who has been disappointed by fewer things than most. A door inside the door 5 opened with a sigh that meant pressure equalized and authority satisfied. We stepped toward it in a line that resembled a prayer if you squinted. The corridor beyond wore wards on its skin like scales. They glowed and dimmed as we passed like animals breathing behind glass. The hum that met us was not music yet. It was the tuning of a throat larger than buildings. It was a sea clearing its throat before it speaks in storms. The floor underfoot changed from stone to metal to something that held both in contempt. My pulse found the external rhythm and nested there as if it had been expected. Ahead, the chamber's doors waited with patient teeth. My palms sweated into the bead bracelet, and the beads remembered similar hands with similar weather. The nulls took their stations, and the world became simpler by subtraction. The soulbinder intoned a sequence number, and the doors answered in 3 tones, like bells that went to war and came back married. The choir mistress raised her bone batons, and the air leaned forward. I drew one breath and kept it where a teacher once told a child to hide a sweet. I stepped because the floor had asked, and because my feet had learned to like being told. The chamber contained a sky and expected gratitude. Rings of machinery knelt around a throne that was not a chair and not a god, and somehow both. Runes crawled along the walls like insects that had memorized scripture. The air tasted of copper and sunburn, and pages turned with wet fingers. Choir galleries spiraled upward, and every rail wore candles inside cages. Flame bowed whenever a servo skull passed. Cables descended from the vault like roots trying to own stone. Each cable ended in a coupling polished by hope. Attendants moved in measured arcs that reminded my bones of lathes. They carried clipboards and reliquaries and knives wrapped in thin linen. The knives smelled of oil and old thunder. A bell sang 3 notes, and the sound made my teeth arrange themselves. The blanks took their stations and smoothed the edges off my terror. Their silence felt heavier than armor. The soulbinder lifted a hand, and I stepped into the circle that had my number on a brass plate. The plate was warm, as if it had been thinking about me. 2 attendants buckled the cradle around my shoulders and hips and throat. Leather learned my shape and decided not to let go. A cold frame slid against my spine with the courtesy of a door closing on weather. The mask descended and kissed my face with institutional tenderness. Its lenses accepted my sight and traded it for a narrower, harder kind. My breath fogged the inside once, and then a tiny vent corrected me. The cable crown lowered with a patient click. Couplings found their homes on sockets that had been painted circles on my scalp. Conductive oil cooled the skin and warmed the fear. The choir mistress tapped her bone batons against the rail, and 100 throats remembered the same pitch. Their first note was a bridge. My bones stepped onto it before I could consider refusal. The machine breathed. It exhaled incense and ozone and expectation. The soulbinder whispered numbers that had the texture of ropes. He laid those numbers across my shoulders like shawls. A sister hospitaller folded my fingers around the bead bracelet and pressed my knuckles to my sternum. Pull when you must, and not before. Her voice was flint struck in a dark shed. I nodded, because nodding is allowed, while your name is still yours. The throne machine spoke to the room in a voice bone's hair. It asked for alignment, and every instrument hurried to agree. The choir answered with vowels full of railings and stone. I felt the sound under my ribs rearrange furniture. A light came up that was not light, and only resembled it for diplomacy. It radiated from a seam in the world that did not look like a seam until you stepped onto it. My head filled with a wind that came from no direction. The soulbinder rested his palm on the crown of my mask and asked who I am. I said my name, and it sounded like a small tool that had done faithful work. He asked what I am. I said measured, and felt the word fit my chest like an old harness. He asked who he is. I did not say the name, because the air saves that for itself. I said my emperor, and the machine let me keep the possessive for one more breath. The coupling at my nape warmed to blood temperature and then passed it. I smelled my childhood dust and the hot metal of the manufactorum and a page from the primer that I had torn and hidden and later put back. The choir's second note landed like a hand on the back of the neck. It pushed. The cradle tightened and the mask's lenses deepened until they were panes of orderly night. Runes bloomed across their inner rim like frost. They marched in pairs and sang to each other in numbers. The soulbinder's assistants fed thin strips of gold leaf into a slot at my shoulder. The leaf carried prayers in a script that disliked curves. The machine chewed the gold and breathed out warmth along my spine. The blanks inhaled in unity, and my panic fell 2 steps behind me. An Auspex arch rolled forward and read the color of my silence. It approved with a thin tone that made the skin between my eyes itch. The choir mistress lifted her batons, and the third note unfurled like a road. I felt it open a gate behind my ribs. The world tilted and settled, and then decided to tilt again. The hum in the floor climbed a half step, and the chamber admitted a new person. He was not a person in the way I was. He was a weight shaped like mercy sharpened into function. He touched nothing and everything straightened. I did not see him. Seeing is too small a verb for that kind of presence. I felt a hand on a world I had been taught is mine when I behave. The hand was gentle and unstoppable at the same time. The choir deepened, and the attendants bent from the waist like reeds practicing obedience. The lights dimmed to doctrine and held there. The blanks stood as if winter had decided to be a geometry lesson. The soulbinder spoke my designation into the crown, and the crown repeated it in a voice that sounded like me if rocks had taught me to speak. A pressure gathered behind my eyes like a storm deciding on a village. The first current touched my spine and anesthetized my name. It was not pain. It was distance. I stood in the outline of myself and watched the contents walk toward the machine. The bead bracelet tightened against my knuckles without being pulled. A tiny click traveled through the cable, like a polite cough in a cathedral. The throne answered with a rise in tone that felt like sunrise under stone. The choir broke into harmonies that knitted the air. To my left, someone sobbed once and swallowed it as a lesson. To my right, a man whispered thank you into a mouthpiece that did not accept or refuse. The floor's resonance climbed until I could count it without numbers. The soulbinder tapped a rune, and a veil lifted between me and another place that was not a place. I looked, and my eyes did what they could. It was not color. It was not shape. It was insistence. A sea pressed against a window that only existed because a saint said it must. Visitors gathered at the glass like moths who had read too much theology. The field held because holding is a profession. The machine asked me to stand in 2 rooms. I did, and the hinge that connected them was my breath. I breathed on the count the choir gave me. I held on the count the blanks allowed me. I released on the count the soulbinder would approve in his logs. The first thread left me in a straight line and entered the circuit like a disciplined volunteer. It carried a memory of wheat dust glittering in a shaft of stolen sunlight. The machine wove it into something that felt like navigation for people who never get to be lost. A second thread followed as if jealous. It carried my mother's laugh, which I had misplaced for years and found again in the mask. It was thinner when it arrived, and stronger when it left. The current thickened, and the cradle found more of me to steady. Electroglyphs stuttered along the cable sheaths and fell into a marching order learned from wars I would never read about. I felt my skull become a bell, and the note it chose was older than the floor. The choir lifted that note and set it among other notes like a torch among torches. The machine shaped the flame into a beam you could steer by. It did not ask if I consented to usefulness. It made consent a verb that happens at the speed of light. The pressure behind my eyes crossed from discomfort into purpose. My tongue tasted citrus and dust and iron, and a sweetness that belonged to solemn rooms. A medic checked my pulse and wrote steady with a line that said she had expected a different word. The blanks gathered the noise my mind tried to make and returned it to me as furniture. Sit here. Look there. Hold this. I obeyed because obedience was a shape that fit. The second current entered and found the places the first had softened. It threaded through them like wire drawn through a die. Heat ran along the mask's rims and argued with the cool blooming in my sternum. Someone across the ring began to chant a child's rhyme in a language the chamber did not recognize. A sister placed a hand on his shoulder, and the rhyme turned into counting. The soulbinder lowered his mouth to the crown and whispered 3 syllables I will never be allowed to remember. They were a key and a promise and a threat wrapped for travel. The machine accepted them and drew a long breath through my nerves. The veil beyond the veil rippled as if someone large had leaned on it. I felt a tension pass across the chamber, the way a searchlight passes across water. It paused at me and catalogued my edges and moved on without taking anything I could name. The choir changed key with intricate unanimity. New harmonics appeared like teeth in a mouth too polite to open fully. The light that was not light narrowed until it was a spear that did not pierce and did not miss. It pointed beyond bulkheads and city and night, and into lanes men only use because despair cannot plot courses. I felt ships like insects in amber murmur gratitude along tethers I did not own. Their astropaths drank our singing and saw a road instead of a mouth. They wrote our names in their ledgers with quills their captains could not see. The current rose again, and the mask cooled to meet it. Sweat gathered under the seals, and the oil made a treaty with it. The bead bracelet pressed harder, and I tasted the wood, as if it had been polished by storms. I pulled one bead because doubt had found a voice and wanted to audition. The bead clicked, and the null at my shoulder breathed in, and my doubt forgot its lines. The soul binder tracked the click on his slate and drew a small circle that meant human and acceptable. The machine drew more of the straight lines that thread from heart to purpose. I watched them leave and arrive and felt no smaller. I felt arranged. Another veil lifted and a corridor opened onto a place that hates corridors. The field there was a choir of knives laid edge to edge and asked to sing. We sang back that we had paperwork. We sang back that our permits were in order. The knives hesitated and reconciled themselves to bureaucracy. The choir mistress etched a new rhythm with her bones, and our breath followed like trained animals glad for instructions. My mind attempted a memory of the manufactorum and could only build a diagram. The diagram had notes in the margin written by someone kinder than the foreman. The foreman in the diagram nodded and stopped shouting, and I recognized the bribery and did not mind. The current found my fear and hired it. It gave fear a cart and a list and sent it running messages. My hands relaxed inside the straps because the hands had work again. The mask lenses pulsed with microscript that praised a calculation I did not know I had made. Attendants moved among us like bees pruning excess blossom. They adjusted a tilt here and a strap there, and a word in a prayer where it needed less flourish. One dabbed sweat from my upper lip and called me steadfast, as if assigning the term to a hook in the ledger. The blanks shifted their weight, and the chamber's thought calmed another degree. Something vast pressed closer outside the arithmetic of walls. It scraped a fingernail along the glass that is not glass. The sound did not exist, and hurt exactly as much as pain you imagine. We answered by opening our throats together. The machine held the answer like a captain holds a heading. The pressure eased and translated itself into distance again. I understood then that distance is a sacrament we offer to the dark. Not rejection, not escape. Arrangement. The throne made a tiny correction to the angle of my tongue. Speech is leverage, and the machine ensures the fulcrum holds. I felt my name lean toward a longer word. The longer word had room for duty and did not need pronouns. The soul binder murmured sanction complete for cycle 1. A bell replied, as if relieved to be believed. He told me to keep breathing, and I obeyed with professional pride. He told me I was sustaining, and I understood sustaining to be a craft like welding. Heat, pressure, timing. Hands that know when to stop and when to make stopping into another kind of forward. The choir modulated and the chamber adjusted its posture. The cables eased a fraction and then tightened in a way that taught without scolding. I tasted smoke from candles that were 2 decks away and older than some planets. The priests along the perimeter pressed stamps against the floor, and the stamps bled wax that cooled in prayer shapes. Servitors rolled incense carts along rails, and the smoke learned to climb without wasting eddies. A sister looked into my lenses, and I saw her eyes as 2 small moons in a pool of disciplined darkness. She nodded once, and I believed I was correctly placed. The field outside deepened into a color only numbers can see. The machine spoke to it as a colleague. They negotiated lanes with formulas and hymns. They agreed on a curve that would not murder those who trusted curves. The soul binder released a fraction of the clamp at my chest, and my next breath arrived with the softness of cloth. He said, "Hold," and I did, and the world leaned and did not fall. He said, "Release," and I did, and the choir caught the breath like a thrown bowl. The blanks were ice in human shapes, and the room depended on their winter to keep the harvest. A medic pressed her thumb to the vein in my wrist and smiled without assertion. She slipped a wafer under the mask, and it melted on my tongue with the taste of chalk persuaded to become mercy. My stomach remembered food as a theory and approved the experiment. The machine whispered a question along my spine, and I answered by tightening my hands 1 bead's width. It understood because understanding is its first language. A bell somewhere far aft rang for a reason that did not need me. The ring arrived in the chamber as a tremble of air more polite than wind. The cables hummed and I hummed, and the hum belonged to all of us. The choir mistress lowered 1 baton, and the note thinned without breaking. A new pattern stood up out of the old pattern, like a soldier out of a trench. We marched it across a distance that dislikes footsteps. We marched it until the distance decided to be road for a little while longer. I felt sweat coast down my temple and catch on the rim of the mask and vanish into felt meant for catching. I watched a star in my head move a finger's width because math had asked nicely. I watched a ship in my head answer with relief, measured in fuel and mothers. The soul binder's slate flashed my designation and a green arc that curved like a smile, taught by engineers. He placed his palm on the crown again, and I understood that the next rise would be taller. I rolled the cog tooth in my fist and thought of meshing and of warm astonishment when teeth meet and neither chips. The machine warmed the room by a degree that predicted survival. I set my breath in the groove the choir carved and let the current take the pieces of me it could use. I kept the rest because the next cycle would ask politely, and I wanted to be able to say yes.